where you have predator-prey coevolution. Okay, this is the last of the lecture. So we're still talking about antagonistic coevolution. In other words, at least one of the players, one of the two species, wins and the other loses, or they both lose. So in terms of intraspecific competition, that means within species. So these wolves are fighting over this carcass. In some species, one individual may be really much more dominant than the other and will likely get more food, while the other one won't, so there'll be a loss of fitness. But over time, those that are more dominant will leave more offspring and increase their fitness at the expense of others. The same thing we can see with these starfish. They're competing against each other. They're all the same species, even though one of them is orange. And they are eating the same food supply, all that kind of stuff, taking up space. They also might be competing with these mussels right there. They're at least competing for space, so that's interspecific competition between different species. Okay, and they might be competing over food as well, but not likely. In fact, actually, I forgot, sea stars eat mussels, and so some of these starfish will probably eat some of these mussels, so that's kind of like what was on the previous page. Okay, so that's what you'll get. And then finally, below here, okay, we have interspecific competition again, right? This time between a giraffe and it looks like a gazelle or an impala, I'm not sure what. It looks like they might be eating the same plant, and so they're competing. But of course, they're not what they can eat is not equal. So the giraffe can reach a lot more vegetation, up to a much taller height compared to this small little antelope. So this is an example of character displacement and niche divergence, in that they're both eating at different parts of the plant, or maybe different plants altogether, and so they're not directly competing. If they were directly competing for exactly the same resources, you might get a situation where you have competitive exclusion and one species goes extinct because of the competition. Okay, and now we're coming to an example of positive interactions. So it'll be plus plus. This is mutualism. If it was within the same species, it would be called cooperation. Cooperation. So that same species. Whereas with this, these are involved in a coevolutionary mutualism, where the hummingbird gets food, namely nectar, that the flower is making. The flower is making the nectar so that it's attractive to pollinators like this hummingbird or insects or some cases bats, things like that. And then when the hummingbird feeds, pollen gets on the hummingbird, and then the hummingbird flies off to the next flower, drinks the nectar there, but pollinates it as well. So the animal is getting a food source, and the plant is getting pollination. So they're both winning, and if they didn't have the situation, in this case, the plant wouldn't get pollinated, because this is when plants have brightly colored flowers or flowers that emit a fragrance or whatever, where they rely on animals for pollination, they advertise. So this plant, this flower, advertises to this hummingbird, and hummingbirds are kind of notorious for liking things that are bright red or pink. Okay, so in this case, this hummingbird probably feeds on a number of different plants and pollinates all of them, some perhaps more than others. Similarly, a lot of animals are seed dispersers, so animals produce fruit. Plants produce fruit. They get pollinated, then they produce fruit. The seeds are inside. Animals come along, eat the fruit, and then poop the seeds out away from the plant where there might be better germination. Okay, and so that's another form of mutualism. You can have other cases like in the ocean. There are these little cleaner fish. You probably know about Nemo, the clownfish. Well, Nemo actually lives inside a sea anemone, and the clownfish actually benefits from that. But there's other clownfish types or wrasses that clean other fish, and so the other fish get cleaned of parasites, and the cleaner gets to eat those parasites. Okay, so there's another one. So that's kind of win-win situation, right? Now, on the bottom here, again we have a hummingbird, right, feeding on this flower. It's a long-tailed sylph that are found in South America. So it's another pollination mutualism, but all of these are pollination mutualisms. And this last one is a moth, but it hovers and it also pollinates. So all of these are convergent mutualisms, adaptations for feeding on nectar, and then the plants in all these cases get pollination services because pollen brushes off on these animals and they go on to the next flower and pollinate. And so on the left is a Hawaiian honeycreeper, only found in Hawaii. This long-tailed sylph hummingbirds are only found in North and South America. This one is South American. African sunbirds in Africa, and then these hummingbird moths or hawk moths are found lots of different places, but they provide the same sort of services in terms of pollination. They get the same sort of food, but instead of having bills, they have a very long proboscis. So these are, let me show you here. So it says, flowers in the coevolve with hummingbirds produce nectar, and the birds, the bills specifically, are shaped to fit into certain flowers. So this one has a slight curve. This sylph down here is a little straighter. There's some hummingbirds with, let me go to the next divergent evolution, like I showed here, on a bunch of different nectar feeders, all showing similar traits that help them feed on nectar, and then the plants get pollination services, so you can see similar kinds of plants. Pollination mutualisms. So here's some more. So it says, describe how coevolution, as with the hummingbird bill and hummingbird pollinated flowers, is different from the kind of evolution described in chapters 11 and 12. Well, in this case, page, with really long bills to fit into a long flower with a long corolla. In fact, there's even a kind of plant in the Caribbean, and there's two different flower types, one for females and one for males. The females are shorter and not as long and rounded, and the males are much longer and rounded, and it's the same plant, but they produce two different flower types. So you can see how the flower shape led to evolution in bill size in the hummingbird, or the bill size also led to flower shape. They both kind of exerted selection on each other over a very long time period until they're perfectly matched. So in some cases like this is can be like a one-to-one match, but oftentimes oftentimes it's what's called a diffuse mutualism. So it says, is coevolution the same thing as convergent evolution? No. Coevolution, you can end up with, but convergent evolution is similar selective pressures, and so if you got nectar feeding niches, in other words, animals that feed on nectar all over the world and they're unrelated, then you're going to end up with convergent mutualisms like you see, like I showed you earlier. Do you think species adapting over time to feed specifically and extremely successfully on another species is an example of coevolution? Well, yeah. Over time, they both select for certain features that end up causing changes in traits in the other one that also affect how well, let's say, the animal feeds and the plant gets pollinated. Okay. And then in this case, we also have a mutualism, symbiotic algae, and corals. And the algae use sunlight to photosynthesize and produce energy in organic compounds. And then the corals use energy in organic compounds from the algae to grow their skeletons, but they also provide the algae with a sheltered place to live in, and they produce carbon dioxide, which the algae need to do photosynthesis. So they're both getting benefits out of this. Either a safe place to live and carbon dioxide to carry out photosynthesis, or for the coral, they get basically sugars from photosynthesis created by the algae. Now, sometimes, and so this is a diffuse mutualism on seed dispersal by these animals that are frugivores. A frugivore eats fruit. Each of these fruits has seeds in them, the honeysuckle, the hawthorn one that we talked about with those flies that were not a mutualism, but those were actually parasitic, the yew, and then barberry. Well, you can see that this blackcap relies mostly on honeysuckle, because you can see the thickness of these green lines, okay? But the honeysuckle doesn't really get that much benefit from a blackcap. Let's okay, so if you look at this, the honeysuckle, the blackcap has a thicker green line, and than to all these other plants. So it shows that it's actually feeding more on honeysuckle. But the honeysuckle, let's see, what else? Well, it doesn't get the greatest dispersal services, but like hawthorn, the hawthorn relies more on the blackcap for food, for dispersal services, but the blackcap eats lots less of the hawthorn, and so there's kind of asymmetric independence. So like this redwing here feeds on all these different fruits, let's say the hawthorn, the yew, the barberry, and to a very small extent the honeysuckle. The hawthorn relies more on the redwing and also the blackcap for dispersal services. And then the yew doesn't rely very much on dispersal services from the redwing, but the blackcap, the barberry gets more dispersal services from more dispersal services from the blackcap than anybody else, because you can see this yellow business is very thick. So you see there's kind of a mutualism between all these birds and all these plants that rely on them. They all make berries. A lot of bird dispersed plants make small berry fruits that the birds can eat and then swallow all in one bite. But some of these birds rely more on other plants, more of certain of these plants than others, whereas the plants might rely more on other birds that maybe don't eat as much of them, but they provide better dispersal services. So, as you can see, this is called a diffuse mutualism, where there's many species of birds and many species of fruit, and they all interact together to one degree or another. Sometimes you have either very specific mutualisms, let's say, here's a hummingbird. Great, my hummingbird's tail. Okay, and flower. And it might be that only this hummingbird feeds on this flower. And so those are called obligate mutualisms. Okay. Okay, now you could also have a situation where you have, let's say, many different birds. Well, first of all, many different flowers. And many different species that pollinate them. And they all might be feeding on these flowers. And vice versa, right? And this is called a diffuse mutualism. Where there might not be such close fit in terms of coevolution as these obligate ones, you know, 1-to-1, but they all get benefits to a certain degree or another.